welcome to the special talk today. This is the series of developmental psychology talk organized by Faculty of Psychology,ฬาลงกรณ University. It's an honor for us here to have a couple who is involved in the work of developmental psychology, especially in youth and child development, and they have a short trip to Thailand, and I kind of steal them from their vacation time to do some academic talk. So please welcome Dr. Benjamin Oosterhoff and also Dr. Cara Oosterhoff for coming to this talk today and giving us a talk. So Ben, would you like to start?
Yes. Hello everyone. Can you all hear me if I don't use the microphone? Bailey, would you like me to use the microphone?
Yeah, please.
Oh, yes. Okay. Do we have something that I can use?
You have the one here if you want to.
How about now?
Yeah, great.
All right. So I'm very happy to be here and to share with you my work on adolescent civic engagement and how the developmental processes that we know that typically happen during adolescence can be used to support youth civic engagement. So I just want to highlight two things before I get started. One is that this talk was designed to be accessible to a lot of different audiences. And so regardless of your training level, I hope that you can find this information relevant and meaningful. And regardless of your degree or discipline, I hope that you can find this information meaningful. That being said, if you have any questions or places where you would like me to clarify anything, please just raise your hand and I'll be happy to do that. Additionally, most of the work that I'm going to be talking to you about today was conducted in the United States. However, I did try to pull in as much cross-cultural work as possible, and much of this work has been done either in Southeast Asia or in Thailand specifically. So please keep that in mind as you hear my work. Okay. So to give you an overview of the progression of my talk, I'm going to start off by talking about a broad perspective on developmental psychology called positive youth development, and how civic engagement can both be an antecedent to and consequent of positive youth development. From there, I'm going to discuss some of the larger limitations of the field, and I'm going to present two studies that sought to address these limitations. I'm then going to end by highlighting some of the limitations of the specific studies that I discuss and talk about some of the future directions that I have moving forward. Okay, so adolescence is usually referred to as the developmental period between the ages of 13 and 18, and it's incredibly interesting. If you think back to when you were a teenager, I'm sure you can imagine that there were a lot of changes that were happening during this time. Socially, usually most youth experience and spend less time with their parents during adolescence and spend more time with their peers. So this is a process that we like to talk about as autonomy development. Additionally, there are a lot of physical changes that happen during this time. Usually, most youth undergo the process of puberty, which is something that we can all probably remember even if we don't wish to. But there are also very important brain development processes that happen as well. So we know that during adolescence, youth become less sensitive to reward, which makes them more likely to engage in a variety of different risky behaviors. So relative to other age periods, during adolescence, individuals are more likely to engage in delinquency or law-breaking behaviors. You're more likely to break the law. You're more likely to use substances such as marijuana, other drugs, or alcohol. You're also more likely to engage in risky sexual practices. So for many youth, this is the first time that they get to experience or explore their own sexuality. And so it's not surprisingly that as many cultures want to limit engagement in risky behaviors. And so a very long history of developmental research has sought to understand why do some youth engage in risk more than others, and how can we prevent that? It wasn't until recently when psychologists have proposed that this might not be the complete picture of adolescent development. that we can also consider adolescence as a period of time characterized by growth and opportunity. a time when youth have the ability to thrive and to really reach their full potential. This strength-based perspective on adolescent development has become known as positive youth development, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Positive youth development does rely on a lot of different things, but one thing that I want to highlight specifically is this idea that youth are going to develop most positively when there is a mutually beneficial relationship between themselves and their context. Now this is a really, really complicated idea, but I'm going to keep coming back to it throughout my talk. But the general notion is that when youth are in contexts that support their skills, strengths, and abilities, they're going to be more likely to develop positively. Based on this idea, I have focused a lot of my work on civic engagement. Civic engagement involves a variety of different behaviors, attitudes, and skills that are conducive of pro-social and political contributions to society. So when we think about civic engagement, we can think about volunteering, we can think about environmental behavior, and in democratic societies, we can think about voting and political involvement. And what's important here is that civic engagement is one type of behavior that benefits both youth and their environment. So if we think back to that mutually beneficial context, this is a pretty key candidate here. So much of my work has focused on the personal benefits youth receive from being civically active. And through this I've shown that youth who are more civically engaged are less likely to engage in substance use, so they use less frequently use drugs and alcohol. They're more likely to engage in physically healthy behaviors, so they're more likely to exercise and they're more likely to have healthier eating habits. They have greater mental health, so they have lower levels of depression and anxiety. They have greater academic achievement, so they get better grades. And they're less likely to engage in delinquency, so they're less likely to break the law. And part of the explanation here is that civic engagement is thought to provide youth with a variety of different resources and benefits that are conducive to health and adjustment. And so some of my work has shown that part of the reason why civic engagement is connected to better health and well-being is because youth have greater access to social support, which we know is incredibly important for health. So you can imagine participating in different volunteering experiences. You're doing that with your peers. And that gives you an opportunity to receive support from your peers, but you're also doing that with usually a volunteer leader or an activity leader who is there to provide you with support as well. So this developmentally is very important for youth and can help bolster positive development. But civic engagement is not only beneficial for youth, it's also beneficial for society. And usually this isn't a point that I need to justify very strongly. Most people can imagine how and why volunteering is good for their community or for society. However, I think it's very helpful to consider how good is volunteering for your society. And there was a very clever study that was conducted where a gentleman had a very similar question. And so what he did was he sought to quantify the economic value of volunteering globally. What would happen if we paid all of our volunteers money for their time? How much money would it cost? Can we put a price on volunteering? And so he did this globally, and he found that the number was very, very large. So if we were to pay volunteers for all of the work they did in 2005, it would cost 1.35 trillion US dollars, which is about the equivalent that would rank 7th in terms of national GDP. So if volunteering was a nation, it would be the 7th richest nation in the world. Now, I found this incredibly interesting, but it also revealed some other interesting statistics about volunteering in Southeast Asia. First, 30% of the population in Southeast Asia volunteered at least once in 2005. That is the highest in the world among all of the other nations or all the other regions sampled here. If you were to pay people for their time for volunteering in Southeast Asia, that would be equivalent to a little over 2 trillion baht for 1 year. Now, part of the reason why this is so important is because this is an industry that directly benefits the less fortunate. And there are not that many industries that have economic value that directly or disproportionately benefit the less fortunate. So volunteering is one example. However, we can also think about how other types of behaviors have a very substantial impact beyond just the immediate community. So environmentalism has a huge global impact. If we can engage youth to be more environmentally conscious, they're not only helping the sustainability of their community, they're helping the world more broadly. Now, it's incredibly important to also consider, well, why are we focusing on adolescents? What is the social value of considering civic engagement among youth? And as developmentalists, we've learned that adolescent civic engagement leads to adult civic engagement. So adolescence is the developmental period when youth are forming the habits, the skills, and the abilities to become civically active, and they carry those with them throughout the course of development. One of the best, if not the best, predictors of whether or not you're going to be civically active when you're an adult is whether you were civically active when you were a teenager. So I feel like I'm taking a lot of credit in presenting something very new and important, but people have been recognizing this for a very long time, and not just researchers. There have been a variety of different organizations that have sought to better understand the political and social viewpoints of youth, so that way they can get a better handle on the issues that might be at the forefront of policy moving forward. A great example of this is the World Bank conducted a survey about 3 years ago in Thailand that asked youth to report on what do you hope for Thailand's future. So they're directly targeting youth to get a better understanding of what are the issues that we see on the forefront of social policy moving forward. From this study, which they had a little over 500 youth participate in, access to quality education was on one of the highest issues that youth raised. Reconciliation of political divisions, so coming together politically, was another issue. Effective laws and justice, and democracy. And the World Bank was not the only one. The United Nations Development Program has also reached out to youth in the Bangkok area to better understand the political viewpoints and how to engage youth in facilitating democracy. And this, just as a note, was in 2015, so this was about 3 years ago, where they brought youth to the United Nations building to understand their perspective. So overall, I just want to really highlight that civic engagement is one way that we can create a synergy, a mutual beneficial relationship between youth and their society. And as we know, earlier civic engagement leads to later civic engagement. This can continue and spiral throughout the course of development if we can engage youth at an earlier age. So unsurprisingly, that's been a lot of the nature of my work, is what leads to adolescent civic engagement. And so I'm going to present you a very complicated model that's very familiar to us as developmental psychologists, but I just want you to know, don't worry, I'll walk you through it. So this is called the ecological model of development. And really what this is showing you is just a way of thinking about how different contexts can support healthy development in youth. You can think about the context that you're a part of right now. How we all usually have a friend group, for instance. Peers is a very important context for youth. School for youth is incredibly important. Church, health services, and so on. So this is just a way of characterizing the different contexts that we have and thinking about how those contexts can promote or deter youth civic engagement. So my work has shown that the messages that parents communicate about what is important about citizenship and what your civic duties are connected with adolescent civic participation. So this is a really fun study that I was able to do where I drove around to rural homes in West Virginia, and I had parents sit on the couch and talk to their teenagers about what it means to be a citizen and what your civic duties are. And I want to show you a clip from this study really fast. Okay, I'm going to try to turn up the volume very fast.
Is it coming from the computer or something?
Does being a citizen mean you have to do anything? What do citizens have to do? Well, being a citizen, you have to like vote. You have to vote, and you have institutional relationship with the community. You have to work. You have to pay taxes. You have to support family, friends, all those things. I mean, it's not just being a citizen is not just like being a Republican, Democrat, or whatever. It's being a part of the community. My view is being a part of the community, helping others. Oh, go ahead, you already know what to do.
So we learned quite a bit from this study. One thing that we learned was that people have a very broad view of what citizenship entails, at least in the United States. Additionally, we learned that the specific messages that parents mentioned during these conversations were associated with similar types of behaviors among youth. So there's potentially room for socialization here of what is expected of you as a citizen, and that may translate into actual behavior. We've also examined how schools can facilitate civic engagement through extracurricular participation. So this includes out-of-school activities such as involvement in clubs, and sports, and involvement in arts in the community. And what we found is that these are what are considered breeding grounds, or these are areas that do a very good job at teaching kids skills on how they can work with other people to address a problem. And that's very important for civic engagement. And we find consistently that involvement in out-of-school activities is associated with greater civic engagement later in life. We've examined religiosity. Religiosity has been examined both here in Thailand and in the United States, and they've consistently found that greater religiosity is connected with greater civic engagement and pro-social behavior, which may be a product of specific religious teachings that often encourage helping other people. And we've also examined how different current events can potentially shape adolescents' concerns about different social issues. So what you have here is on the right, you have a graph of adolescents' concerns about economic problems, and this data was collected from separate cohorts of teenagers each year from 1976 up into 2014. So these are different groups of youth. What we found was that we see these spikes or peaks in adolescents' concerns about economic issues during times in the United States that were characterized by high levels of economic problems. What this helps show is that youth are paying attention to the social issues around them, and those are affecting the types of issues that they view as being relevant. So although we've learned a lot up until this point about the antecedents of civic engagement, there are still some very important limitations of the field. First, we do not know very much about how civic engagement intersects with emotional and social cognitive development. These are things that show substantial growth across the period of late childhood and adolescence. And so to build a developmental theory of youth civic engagement, it's important to understand how these are connected. Additionally, most of our research has really focused on one or two different specific civic behaviors, and we haven't done a very good job so far of treating civic engagement as multifaceted, even though we talk about it as being multifaceted. And lastly, we don't know very much about how non-normative experiences or atypical experiences, such as being the victim of crime, may also promote civic engagement. So I'm going to present two studies that seek to address these limitations. The first study is going to focus on these first two limitations here. And really the goals of this study was to better understand how emotional and social cognitive competencies intersect with adolescent civic engagement. For the purpose of this study, we kind of defined developmental competencies as skills and abilities that show typical change across late childhood and adolescence. We selected two emotional competencies, One being emotion regulations, the ability to regulate and control your emotional experiences. Cara is going to talk about this in much more detail moving forward, so get excited. And so the idea here is that if you have more emotional dysregulation, it might interfere with your ability to help other people and engage within your community. We also examined empathy, or having just a concern for others more broadly. Many civic behaviors involve helping other people, so we thought that having greater concern may be very important for civic engagement. We also selected 2 social cognitive competencies. Future-mindedness, which is the ability to think about how your actions are going to affect the future. Many civic behaviors have long-term consequences for the future, and so being able to anticipate and think about what those consequences are may be important for civic engagement. And moral reasoning, or the ability to prioritize the welfare of other people over your own. Again, since many civic behaviors concern others, we thought that this would be very important. And the goal here is to examine how these developmental competencies are connected with civic engagement among youth. So we recruited 17 different elementary, middle, and high schools from 3 different regions within the United States. One was in urban California, one was in suburban Minnesota, and one was in rural West Virginia, where I was based at the time. From this recruitment efforts, we received surveys from about 2,500 youth, ages 8 to 20. Most youth were ages 10 to 18. So this was in the United States, it was 4th grade through 12th grade. Youth vary in their race and ethnicity and in their financial strain, so we did get good variability there. And for our measures, we focused on 8 different indicators of civic engagement. So again, we tried to get very broad. 5 of them were behaviors: environmental behavior, volunteering, informal helping, voting intentions. In the United States, youth are not able to vote until they're 18. And so we assess voting intentions to be able to include youth who are under 18. News consumption, and we included 3 different cognitive elements of civic engagement, including social responsibility values, or the importance that youth place on considering the needs of other people. Political beliefs, which is really whether or not youth believe you should engage in political behavior. And civic skills, including self-ratings of youth's ability to create a plan to address an issue. So again, we had these 4 developmental competencies: emotion regulation and empathy, future-mindedness, and moral reasoning. So I just wanted to show this slide so you can see how they were measured. Okay, so moving to our findings, we found that in terms of emotional competencies, greater emotion regulation was connected to higher informal helping, higher civic skills, and higher environmental behaviors. So the greater ability you had to regulate your emotions, the more involved you were in these activities, and the greater civic skills that you had. For empathy, we found that greater empathy was connected with almost every indicator of civic engagement except for news consumption. So the higher empathy that you had, the more civically engaged you were overall, except for news consumption. For the social cognitive competencies, we found similar patterns with future-mindedness. So the more future-minded you were, the more engaged you were across almost every civic engagement measure, except for environmental behavior. And for moral reasoning, we found that greater moral reasoning was connected with greater social responsibility, greater informal helping, and greater civic skills. So, additionally, we did examine whether or not these connections varied by different demographic characteristics. Were they moderated by grade, gender, race, ethnicity, or location? We didn't find any evidence of this, but I just wanted to point that out, that we did look at it and we didn't find any evidence. So the very broad conclusions that you can draw from this study is that developmental competencies are connected with civic engagement in a very meaningful way. We found the most broad level support for empathy and future-mindedness. This may be because having a concern for others is a general trend that's found across a variety of different civic indicators. And also considering how these behaviors impact the future, it just might be a more general trend or pattern or theme that goes across many of these indicators. We did find greater specificity for emotion regulation and moral reasoning. I want to highlight that this doesn't necessarily mean that these are unimportant competencies. However, the developmental story may just be a little bit more nuanced. Overall, I think this provides a good foundation or a good initial evidence to move towards a developmental theory of youth civic engagement by placing it within a broader developmental context. There were some important limitations. This is self-report data and it is cross-sectional. And so we are going to need to be cautious of this moving forward and make sure that we at least get multiple reporters of some of these measures. Behavioral measures would be great, and to examine these processes longitudinally. Okay, do I have any questions up to this point? Fantastic. All right, so this study was meant to address these first two limitations. The next study I'm going to present is really meant to better understand how non-normative experiences can intersect with civic engagement. So we're going to focus down here. And so this is a study that was recently published in American Psychologist that examined the links between youth victimization, beliefs about government, and political participation. And so this study relies on a different idea called social contract theory. Social contract theory has been used by political philosophers and psychologists as a way of understanding how people interact with government. And the general idea is that as citizens, we have certain obligations that we owe the political system, so that we owe people on a collective level. And in return, that political system has certain obligations it needs to fulfill for us. Now, what these are varies based on the political system that you have, it varies based on culture, and it can even vary based on your perception. In the United States, theorists have pointed out that we as citizens forfeit certain freedoms, such as we agree that we need to obey the laws, and we perform our civic duties, which can include political voting, political engagement. And in return, the government is meant to provide us with some basic human rights, including securing our safety and liberty. So one of the obligations of government is to keep us safe. And my work has shown that in the United States, youth recognize this social contract. I have shown this through studies that have demonstrated that youth view that they're not allowed to infringe on the rights of other people, even if there are no laws preventing them from doing so. That youth feel that they're obligated to give back to the community and engage in politics. But importantly, that youth view that government is obligated to keep them safe. And so one question that I had was, what happens when this social contract is violated? What happens when youth experience criminal victimization? What happens when they're the victim of crime? Because for those youth, the government has failed to uphold the social contract and has not kept them safe. John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, some very famous philosophers, have proposed that when the social contract is violated, youth are obligated to withdraw their support from government and work to change the political system. And so I had two broad aims with this study. I wanted to know, how is youth victimization connected with adolescents' beliefs about government, with the hypothesis that youth who are victimized are going to be more unhappy or more discontent with government? And how does youth victimization relate to their engagement in politics? If John Locke is correct, we would expect that youth who have been victimized are going to be more politically active. Now, in approaching this study, I ran into a lot of really important methodological considerations. One is that national elections in the United States are held every 4 years, which means that some youth may not have the opportunity to engage in politics based on what year the data was collected. Additionally, we've found a wide variety of demographic differences in both political engagement and in victimization. And so I've attempted to address these limitations by using data collected from different cohorts of youth each year from 1976 until 2014. I've looked at both past political behavior and intent to engage in future political behavior among youth that haven't already completed any type of political behavior, and accounted for a very wide variety of different covariates. Okay, so data for this study came from the Monitoring the Future study. This is publicly available data, it's online. They collected a new cohort of youth, new cohort of 12th grade seniors each year from 1976, and the study is ongoing, which gave us a total sample size of about 110,000 youth. So the demographics are posted there. For victimization, there were 7 items assessing the frequency that youth experience different types of victimization within the past 12 months. These ranged from being physically assaulted with a weapon down to different forms of property damage, such as having your property stolen, for instance. For beliefs about government or discontent with government, we had 5 items. An example question is, do you think some of the people running the government are crooked or dishonest? And so many of these just tapped in youth's beliefs about the performance of government. And for political behaviors, we had 6 different political behaviors. Voting, donating to a campaign, volunteering for a campaign, writing public officials, protesting, and boycotting. Again, we measured both intent among people who have not engaged in these behaviors and engagement in these behaviors as well. Okay, so I want to show you how I'm going to present some of these results. This is what is called a forest plot. And what you have is the dependent variable is on the left-hand side, and these are different beliefs about government. So different, the specific beliefs and then an overall score. The bottom line is the standardized regression coefficient. So we used hierarchical linear modeling for this study, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that later. But what you need to know right now is that as long as the effect is on the right side of the line, it's positive. And as long as the error bars don't encompass the line, which is 0. So in general, what we found was greater victimization was associated with greater discontent with government. This was consistent for each of the specific beliefs we examined, as well as overall. So this provides initial support for my hypotheses. However, we wanted to perform a variety of different sensitivity analyses to see how robust this association was. So we examined links between victimization and discontent with government across different forms of victimization. So we looked at the effects separately for property damage versus physical assault. In general, I would just like to point out that all of the effects are significant, all of them are positive. So greater victimization, regardless of the type, is associated with greater discontent with government. However, you do see a slightly stronger effect for physical assault versus property damage, which may be because physical assault is a more serious form of victimization than having something stolen. Next, I wanted to know, well, is this consistent for different subgroups of youth? So we plotted the effect based on whether you're male or female, under 18 or over 18, your race and ethnicity, parents' education level, political beliefs, rural versus urban community contexts, whether you come from a single parent family home or a 2-parent home, and your school track. Again, the overall take-home message here is that the effect is largely consistent across these different subgroups. Greater victimization is associated with greater discontent with government. We also plotted it based on the cohort from which the data were drawn, and the accompanying presidential cabinet that was in office at the time in the United States. And again, you see a great deal of consistency here in that the effect is always positive and always significant. Greater victimization is connected with greater discontent with government, regardless of the presidential cabinet that was in office. So now I feel a little bit better about these findings. What about political engagement? Again, so you have the political behaviors on the left and the standardized effect down. We consistently found that greater victimization was connected with greater political engagement among youth. When we examine the effect based on intent for political engagement, we find a very similar trend, where for most political behaviors, greater victimization is connected with a greater intent to engage in political action. Turning to the type of victimization, it's probably not too surprising at this point, but we found similar trends, that greater victimization was connected with greater political engagement regardless of the type of victimization that you experienced. Similar patterns for subgroup of youth as well, regardless of if you're male or female, under 18 or over 18, race, ethnicity, and so on, greater victimization was connected with greater political engagement. And regardless of the presidential cabinet that was in office, greater victimization was connected with greater political engagement. Okay, so I think what this study does a great job of demonstrating, it provides fairly strong support that at least cross-sectionally, the more victimization that you experience, the more unhappy you are with government, and the more politically active you are in the United States. It's important to note that this is very consistent with work that's been done in countries that have had recent political reforms and that have been stricken by war. So this has been consistent in Palestine. Palestinian youth, Brian Barber did some wonderful work there that has shown a very similar pattern. It's also been demonstrated among Venezuelan youth. So there is some evidence that this isn't just an American phenomenon, that this may be happening globally as well. I do think these findings have some very important implications for theory and policy. First, in democracies, I think that it demonstrates that we can consider treating victimized youth as an asset. In democratic nations, we want people to be engaged politically, and so we appear to have a population that is motivated to be politically active. And so if we can provide opportunities for these youth to become involved in politics, we're going to be able to incorporate diverse perspectives and engage youth, which, as we know, will follow them throughout the course of development. But there are also some very interesting implications for clinical efforts that have worked with trauma-exposed youth, in which they have attempted to repair the social contract and facilitate more positive perceptions of youth's communities among this population. So what this is just demonstrating is, again, there seems to be a motivation for youth to become engaged in politics. If we can engage them, we may be able to facilitate a more positive view about the political system and help them with potentially post-traumatic stress symptoms. So for future directions, I think it's going to be very important to examine the explanatory processes that account for this. Do these youth actually view that government did not uphold their responsibility to keep them safe, as that's what motivated them to become politically active? Are there emotional processes involved in this process? So are these youth, does violations of the social contract spark anger, which motivates political action? I think that would be very important. And additionally, this is cross-sectional work, so we do need to model this longitudinally. Further, I think we need to show that political engagement may be beneficial for victimized youth. I do have some preliminary data that has examined this, and so far everything is coming out fairly consistent that, at least for self-esteem, youth who have been victimized, who engage in politics, tend to have higher self-esteem than those who have not engaged in politics. Okay, so I think more broadly though, this model has a lot of implications beyond just the work that we've done in the United States. I think that it's going to be important to consider what is the social contract in other cultures. How do youth view this social contract? How does it connect with their own form of engagement? So a great question could be, how do Thai youth view the responsibilities of government? How do they view their own responsibilities? What happens when government doesn't uphold their responsibilities? These are kind of transferable questions that can be asked across different cultures and we may find some meaningful variation. So this is just a general way of saying that this may be a broader model to operate within that hasn't received a lot of empirical attention quite yet. Additionally, I think it does help inform a broader developmental theory of youth civic engagement by demonstrating that civic engagement is not only predicated by positive experiences, that negative experiences can also lead to civic action. And so right now, most of the work has been dedicated to understanding how context and experiences intersect with civic engagement. However, I think that this needs to be expanded to better understand how context and experiences may be dynamically tied to greater motivation and competencies, how motivation and competencies are dynamically tied to civic engagement, and how civic engagement is dynamically tied to health and well-being. And so there's a lot of room for growth here if we're asking the correct types of questions. Okay, so I would just like to thank all of the youth who have participated in my research. I'd like to thank my funding sources, and I would like to invite anyone here who has questions to contact me, or if they're interested in the subject, please contact me, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have right now.
We have the political democracy on hold in our culture, in our country. What's your so the nature of our political situation is different from what it is in the U.S. So it's I don't have a question, but I think it might be interesting to see, that we have, the ongoing change between military government in alternate with, kind of like every 4 or 5 years we change, political system at different times. So it would be interesting to look for more data on how youth react to the situation and how they feel like they would be more motivated to engage in civic issues.
Absolutely. So the comment was that here in Thailand, the political system is very, very different than that of the United States, in that there are waves of different political systems that are in place. And so how might that kind of fit in with some of the work that I've been doing? And I think that really it excites me a lot, because I think that it helps us. Most of the work that has been done in this arena has been with United States youth, and it really draws a very important limitation to that work. How can we say that these processes are general across human development? We can't. We can't say those things. We have to take the political context into account, and we haven't been doing a very good job of that. I'm not sure why, but it's something that I'm very interested in pursuing moving forward. I think that social contract theory would be a really interesting model to apply here, based on the drastically different and shifting political systems that are in place. There has been, I can recall one study that examined Thai youth's perspectives of democracy. And it was very interesting, because what they found was there were some similarities. There were, Thai youth recognized key components of democracy, including a constitution, and idealized versions of what a democracy should be. But there were some very important differences. And I think that being able to integrate those differences within this model, we'll be able to get a better understanding of what these processes are like for youth more broadly. Again, social contract theory can be adapted to different political systems, because it's about youth's perception. It's about their view of what their responsibility is to government, their view of what government's responsibility is to them. There may be some consistencies. It could be that for youth involved in a lot of different political systems, they think that a very central responsibility of government is to keep them safe. but there may not be consistencies in other areas too. So for us to be able to actually examine that would give us a wider view of what these processes can look like.
I have two questions. Let me go back to civic engagement. In the empirical research, you show that future mindedness didn't connect to environmental behavior. But I quite confused that when I do something for preserving environment, I often think of the next generation, but you show that it didn't connect. This is my first question. May you explain why? And the second question, how victimization shape our brain? Because you said civil engagement connect to developmental model, right? Bioecology, something. Yeah, and so it should imply that victimization shape our brain too, right?
Oh, okay, neurological changes. Okay, yes. So if I understand your question, I think the first question was we didn't find a connection between future-mindedness and environmental behaviors. Why might we have not found a connection there, given that there's a really intuitive explanation? That would be a very intuitive connection we would expect. So that's a very great question because we were surprised by that as well. And in our explanation right now, one possibility could be that for young kids, especially where some of these kids were 8 years old, they were in 4th grade, many environmental behaviors could be rules that parents have. You recycle your paper, they might not connect that to this broader goal. So my explanation is that it might have to do with our measure of environmental behaviors, where we didn't disentangle whether or not kids are actually doing that to preserve the environment moving forward. Rather, we focused on this specific action. And so we can't unpack that with other family rules they might have. So we consider it environmental. We don't know if the kids consider it environmental. And that might be why we didn't find that connection. The second question is, we know that victimization can have neurological implications for the structure of your brain. In thinking about civic engagement and political action developmentally, how does that fit into the results that I've found and into the broader model that we have? Is that correct?
Yeah, right. Right.
Okay, I think that's a great question, and it gets into questions about what's explaining these effects. So in the trauma field, what we find a lot is that kids who have experienced trauma and victimization have a hypersensitivity to threat and to fear. And so victimization can contribute to emotional dysregulation. They're less able to regulate their emotions physiologically. And so if part of the motivation behind victimized youth to engage in politics could be anger towards the political system, it could be possible that experiencing victimization makes you more sensitive to your emotional motivations, such as approach, which might explain why you see a greater tendency for victimized youth to be politically active. There are a lot of assumptions that are a part of that explanation that have not been tested, so it's just my thinking about it, but I think it's going to be really important to test as we move forward. Any other questions? Thank you very much.
It is very nice that you can use the perspective of psychology to tie into these political questions that mostly people think about it is as a talk in political science group, but actually we can look at the viewpoint of youth development and how they think about their engagement in terms of political and civic engagement. So this is very nice talk, and thank you so much. And now it's probably the time for Dr. Cara Oosterhoff. Sorry. Okay.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about sleep and emotional risk in children. And the thing that I absolutely love about this topic is that we spend so much of our life sleeping, and we really know relatively little about it. So just an overview of what I'll be talking about today. So first I'll just talk a little bit about the importance of sleep for functioning, in particular for youth and for their healthy development. And then I'll talk a little bit about sleep and emotional risk in particular, and how this might relate to mental health in children. And then I'll talk about some limitations in the sleep and emotion research area, so some things that we do not know about this yet, which will lead me into some studies that I've conducted to try to capitalize on these limitations. So I'll talk about 2 studies in particular that I've done. And then I'll end talking a little bit about some future directions in this area that we need to accomplish. So first, I just want everyone to take a moment and think about the fact that we spend about a third of our life sleeping. So for the average person, this works out to be about 25 years total that we spend asleep. And children tend to sleep more than adults, and so if you look at the amount of time that children spend sleeping throughout their childhood, it works out to be about 40% of their life. Now, despite the amount of time that we spend sleeping, this type of research on sleep has received much less empirical or research attention than a lot of other waking behaviors that we engage in. And really most of what we know about sleep has come from just the last 25 years or so of research, mostly due to advances in technology and our ability to actually measure and look at sleep. And while we can't say that the amount of time we spend sleeping necessarily means that it's important, we do know that it seems to impact nearly every domain of our functioning. So we know from research in adults, if we deprive them of sleep, and don't let them sleep, we see a whole range of different effects in terms of their cognitive functioning, so their ability to problem solve, their ability to pay attention. It impacts their immune system, it impacts their mood and their mental health, and all types of physical issues as well, so heart health, cancer risk, and so on. And research in children has been much less overall, and most of it has been correlational, so there's not a lot of studies that have actually restricted children's sleep. But a lot of the effects that we've found tend to be pretty similar to effects in adults as well. So we see that children who sleep less tend to get sick more often, they tend to take more risks, so as a result, kids who get less sleep are more likely to end up in the hospital for things like broken bones, things of that nature. They have a harder time paying attention, so a lot of times, at least in the United States, children get misdiagnosed with ADHD, but really it's just that they're not getting enough sleep. So they're showing a lot of the same behaviors you would see in ADHD, like a lack of ability to pay attention and so on. So the obvious answer to not getting enough sleep is to simply get more sleep. But anyone who has struggled with their sleep knows that that's easier said than done. And so in the United States, the United States Center for Disease Control recently named inadequate sleep a public health epidemic because so many people are not getting enough sleep. And many American children and even more American teenagers or adolescents are not getting enough sleep. So almost 80% of adolescents are not getting enough sleep. And there's not a lot of cross-cultural research that has been done on this, but one study that compared sleep in infants and toddlers across a variety of different countries found that rates of inadequate sleep in both Thailand and in the US, as you can see from the graph on the side, tends to be pretty comparable. And there's also historical trends suggesting that this inadequate sleep is something that seems to be getting worse over time as well. And so one study looked at studies that have reported sleep, rates of sleep across years from 1905 all the way to 2008, and found that in some regions of the world, so parts of Asia, North America, and then parts of Europe, there were average declines of about 0.75 minutes every single year throughout the century. So overall, this totals to be about an hour less sleep over that time period. And studies within the United States have found that since the 1990s until now, this trend seems to be most severe, most profound. So much so that they've called the current time that we're in the United States as the Great Sleep Recession. So we're losing out on all of this sleep during this time, and it seems to be getting worse. And so there's a lot of different reasons why sleep might be impacted. So there's different biological or genetic determinants that might impact our sleep. So a lot of sleep disorders tend to run in families. Things like insomnia, so having difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep or waking up too early, does have a genetic component to it. But there's a lot of contextual or environmental variables that we can think about as well. Some similar to the contextual variables that Ben talked about in terms of his research. So seeing things like family and school. So parents set rules around bedtime. So they might set more limits for their kids in terms of when they need to go to sleep. Some parents might set less limits. Things like when school starts in the morning can impact when children have to wake up and if they're getting more or less sleep. And there's also a huge impact of the sleep environment as well. So things like noise. So if you live in a busy city like Bangkok or where I live in Houston, if there's a lot of noise, it might be difficult to fall asleep. Things like temperature as well. So in warmer temperatures, it's more difficult to fall asleep and stay asleep. And then also light too. So in particular, blue light, which is the light that tends to be emitted from things like laptops or cell phones, in particular seems to impact our sleep. So there's a hormone called melatonin that gets released that makes us tired and sleepy. And when we're exposed to blue light, that hormone gets suppressed. And so if you are laying awake at night on your phone in bed, what's going to happen is it's going to be more difficult to fall asleep later on. So things like this can be impacting kids' sleep, which might be why it's getting worse, especially over the last several decades as we've had more advances in technology. And then there's also cultural influences as well. So rates of insufficient sleep in children varies across countries. So in Japan it tends to be the worst, and then it tends to be the best in countries like Australia and New Zealand and parts of Scandinavia. And these historical trends seem to be different as well across different countries. So while it's getting worse and sleep is getting worse across many different countries, it actually seems to be getting better in some areas. So again, like Australia, the UK, and then parts of Scandinavia as well. So in addition to thinking about why people aren't getting enough sleep, what my primary area is looking at how inadequate sleep is impacting children's emotional health. And so I think probably the most compelling evidence for why sleep impacts emotion is that sleep problems are present in the majority of children with anxiety and depressive disorders. Now this isn't too surprising if anyone's familiar with those disorders, because sleep problems are actually part of the diagnostic criteria for these disorders. So it makes sense that if you're diagnosed with one of these disorders, you might also have sleep problems. But research that's followed children over time has found that sleep problems actually tend to precede or come before the onset of these disorders. So for example, one study looked at sleep problems in children between the ages of 5 to 9 years old, and found that children who had persistent or ongoing sleep problems during this time were 50% of them went on to develop an anxiety disorder by young adulthood, so about half of them. Other studies have shown that sleep problems at the age of 5 predict a diagnosis of depression nearly 30 years later. So this longitudinal research is pretty compelling. And so myself and others have theorized that the reason for this link between sleep problems and psychiatric risk might be due to emotional difficulties. So sleep problems might lead to more emotional difficulties, which in turn might lead to more psychiatric risk. And so I recently empirically tested this and found that that was the case. So greater sleep problems, so greater difficulty falling asleep, greater difficulty staying asleep or waking up too early in adolescence was linked with greater difficulties regulating emotions in stressful social situations. And this in turn predicted greater likelihood of being diagnosed with either a mood or an anxiety disorder. So most of the research on sleep and emotion in particular has been conducted in adults. And the research tends to suggest that there is a strong link between these two processes. And so one study compared a whole bunch of studies using meta-analytic techniques to look at how sleep impacted mood versus other domains, and found that while sleep impacted nearly every domain of functioning, its effects on mood tended to be the most strong compared to other things like cognitive functioning and physical functioning. And then other research has looked more specifically at the types of emotional processes that might be impacted. So one seminal study that I like in particular, what they did was they had a group of adults and they sleep deprived them for 35 hours. So kept them awake for 35 hours. And then they had them look at a range of different negative emotional pictures and pictures that were relatively neutral. So not emotional, not negative or positive in any way. And then they had them sit in a brain scanner while they were looking at these pictures. And what they found was that for the group that was sleep deprived compared to a group that was allowed to sleep, they found that when they were looking at these negative emotional pictures, they saw increased activity in their amygdala, which is an area of the brain that tends to be associated with emotional reactions. They didn't find this for the neutral pictures, so this was in particular for those negative emotional pictures. And so you can see that on the graph on the left here. And this difference in the reactivity in the amygdala is 60% in magnitude, so a pretty strong difference between these two groups. And then in addition to that, they also found that the sleep-deprived group also had less activity in their prefrontal cortex, which is the area of the brain that you would typically see when people were able to regulate and control their emotional responses. So essentially, after this sleep deprivation, people were not only reacting more strongly, but they were also controlling their emotional reactions less as well. And so some pretty profound effects here. And so moving on to some of the limitations in what we know about sleep and emotion research. I think the biggest limitation is that there's really just a lack of experimental research in youth. So there's not a lot of studies that have manipulated children's sleep or changed their sleep to look at the effects afterwards. And one reason why this is important is that, in particular, late childhood and that transition to adolescence might be a possible sensitive period where sleep is necessary for healthy emotional development. One reason why is that there's just a greater drive to sleep during this age. So children and adolescents tend to sleep more than adults. And as a result, this may be more important for them during these ages. They're also, as Ben talked about, undergoing quite a lot of different physical, emotional, and social changes. So there's a lot of learning going on during this stage. And one thing that we know about sleep is that it's very important for learning. So while people are sleeping, there's a lot of changes going on in the brain. So a lot of synaptic pruning and cortical activity, which is necessary for remembering things and consolidating experiences throughout the day. So if adolescents are going through all of these new experiences and not able to learn from them in the way they need to, that might be a problem. And so one study did compare the effects of sleep loss in teenagers compared to adults, and did find that teenagers had greater emotional effects after sleep restriction compared to adults. But this is only one study that's looked at these differences. And so another limitation is that the majority of research on sleep and emotion has not really investigated the specific components of emotion that might be impacted. And so the majority of research has looked at psychiatric symptoms, so things like anxiety symptoms or depressive symptoms, or just looked at non-specific indicators of emotion, and hasn't really targeted the specific components of emotion that might be most impacted by sleep. And so in particular, we can think about emotion as falling on this graph right here, where we can think about it in terms of valence, so how good or how bad do you feel, but also in terms of arousal, so how intensely are you feeling that emotion. And this is also important because emotions are multifaceted, so it's not just what people say they're feeling, but it might also be how they're expressing their emotion or how they're feeling that emotion physiologically. And in terms of how sleep has been measured in children, this is also a huge limitation in the literature. And so the majority of research has focused on parents' reported sleep problems. And often they just ask one question: does your child experience sleep problems or not, without looking at the specific types of sleep problems that children might be experiencing. And so this is a problem, one, because parents might not be aware of what's going on while their children are sleeping, especially if their children sleep in a different room. It might not be something that they're around to see happening. And in addition, these different types of sleep problems might differentially impact emotion as well. So research coming out of my lab at the University of Houston has found that in children, difficulty falling asleep is associated with emotional difficulties, but difficulties waking up throughout the night is not associated with emotional outcomes. So that suggests that looking at specific types of sleep problems is important. And in addition, instead of thinking about just looking at reports of sleep, there are other more accurate ways to look at sleep as well. So two methods that we use to accurately measure sleep include actigraphy and then polysomnography, which I'll talk about. And so actigraphy is most usually a wristwatch that people wear. And inside the wristwatch is an accelerometer, which is similar to like what's in a cell phone or an iPhone. If you're walking, it measures your movement. And what we can use is, once people wear this watch, we have them wear it for typically about a week. And we can use reliable algorithms to determine when they're awake and when they're asleep. So the output we get from this watch looks like this over here on the graph. And so all of the black lines correspond with movement throughout the day. And we can see based on when people are not moving, we can pretty reliably predict when they're asleep. And so this allows us to accurately measure things like how much time people are sleeping, how long it takes them to fall asleep, if they're waking up throughout the night, and so on. And this tends to be more accurate than when we ask people to report on that, because it's often hard to remember. And then we can also use polysomnography as well. And so polysomnography is a different combination of physiological measures. So we use EEG, which are electrodes on the head. We also use EOG, so electrodes on the eye to measure eye movements, and then also electrodes on the face to measure facial movements as well. And this tends to be the most accurate and the most reliable way of measuring sleep. And the nice thing about polysomnography is because we're looking at brain waves, we can actually look at different types of sleep that are occurring as well. So different types of sleep stages. And so generally sleep is divided into two main types. So there's non-rapid eye movement sleep, which is further broken up into three different stages. So you have stage 1, which is the transition between wake and sleep, then stage 2, and then stage 3, which we also refer to as slow wave sleep. And this tends to be the deepest, most restorative sleep. And then we also have rapid eye movement sleep as well, which is when most dreaming activity occurs. And so using polysomnography, what we can do is determine what we call somebody's sleep architecture. And so this is essentially the amount of time they spend in different sleep stages throughout the night. And so this is a hypnogram which outlines what somebody's sleep might look like throughout the night. So you can see there's a lot of this slow wave sleep or stage 3 sleep earlier on in the night, and then more REM sleep later on in the night as well. And so one reason why looking at sleep architecture in particular is important for my research is that in adults we know that people's sleep architecture or the structure of their sleep stages tends to be highly correlated with things like depression. So less slow wave sleep throughout the night tends to be correlated with higher rates of depression in adults. And then also altered REM sleep or rapid eye movement sleep as well. So people who experience more rapid eye movement sleep are more likely to be diagnosed with depression. People who go into rapid eye movement sleep earlier in the night are also more likely to be diagnosed with depression too. However, we really don't know that much about this in children. And this might be important to examine because not only do we know that children and adolescents sleep more than adults, but the structure of their sleep is also different as well. So younger ages tend to spend more time in rapid eye movement sleep, which suggests that this might be serving different functions for younger ages. Okay, so that brings me to my first study. So I was interested in thinking about how the sleep architecture or sleep neurophysiology relates to emotional experiences in youth who are at risk for emotional problems. And so in particular, I looked at this in a sample of children with anxiety disorders. And the reason why I did that, well, there's a few reasons. One is that children with anxiety disorders have high rates of sleep problems. So up to 95% of children with anxiety disorders report at least one type of sleep problem. So this is an area of concern for children with these disorders. Children with anxiety are also at high risk for emotional problems throughout their life as well. So children who are diagnosed with anxiety at an early age are at risk to suffer from different psychiatric disorders throughout the lifespan. And then another reason is that things like hypervigilance and worry just tend to be incompatible with sleep. So children with anxiety disorders who tend to worry a lot have a more difficult time falling asleep if they're laying awake at night, and they are experiencing high levels of physiological arousal where they're unable to sleep. And so my main aims were to look at if anxious youth experience altered sleep architecture, so different sleep architecture compared to children who are non-anxious, and then if these different sleep profiles, so differences in sleep architecture, were related to daytime symptoms in these anxious youth. And so in particular, I looked at stage 3 sleep or slow wave sleep, and then amount of rapid eye movement sleep, and then the latency to rapid eye movement sleep, so similar to the variables that seem to be important in adults. So my sample was 66 participants across 2 different sites, so one in Houston, Texas, and one in Washington, D.C. These children were between the ages of 7 and 11, and they were all pre-puberty, so before that transition to adolescence. And a little less than half the sample had generalized anxiety disorder. And some of them had different secondary disorders, but one thing that's notable about the sample is that none of them had any mood disorders, which is important because a lot of times anxiety and depression go hand in hand and they're comorbid, and so these children did not have any mood disorders. And so for the study, so children came in for an initial visit. During this time, we conducted a clinical interview to determine their diagnostic status. And then children reported on their depressive symptoms, their anxiety symptoms, and then also their physiological hyperarousal as well. And then for 1 week, we had children wear an actigraph to measure their sleep across the course of 1 week. And then every single night, they completed phone calls and they reported on their negative affect that occurred throughout the day. So the different negative emotions that they experienced. And then following that week, either on a Friday or Saturday night on a weekend, we had them complete 1 night of polysomnography, where they slept with the electrodes on their head so we can measure their sleep stages. And from this, we extracted the percentage of time that they spent in stage 3 sleep, the percentage of time they spent in rapid eye movement sleep, and then how long it took them to first go into rapid eye movement sleep throughout the night. So first, just looking at initial differences in their sleep architecture between the control group and the anxious group. We did not find any significant differences in sleep architecture. So both healthy kids and anxious kids spend about the same amount of time in each sleep stage. Looking at differences across the groups in terms of their daily symptoms, we found that the anxious group experienced greater symptoms, which you would expect compared to the control group. So they experienced greater negative affect throughout the day, greater depressive symptoms, greater anxiety symptoms, and greater physiological hyperarousal. So next we were curious to see if these patterns of sleep architecture were associated with their daytime symptoms. And so what we found was that greater slow wave sleep was related to less negative affect over the course of that week. However, this was only for the anxious sample and not for the non-anxious sample. We didn't find any associations between sleep architecture and anxiety symptoms or physiological hyperarousal. However, we did find associations between sleep architecture and depressive symptoms. So in particular, this was for rapid eye movement sleep. So we found that increased rapid eye movement sleep was related to greater depressive symptoms, but again, this was only for the anxious youth and not for the non-anxious youth. And then again, for only the anxious children, we found that having less time before you go into rapid eye movement sleep was related to greater depressive symptoms, but again, this was not for the non-anxious children. So just to summarize these findings, so we didn't find any differences in sleep architecture across these groups. And so this contrasts reliable findings in adult patients where you do find these differences between samples that have disorders versus samples that do not. And this might have something to do with some of the developmental differences we see in sleep. So one, because children do have greater rapid eye movement sleep that might possibly hide some of these effects. The other difference is just in sleep pressure overall. So children have greater sleep pressure, they have a greater drive to sleep, and that might be hiding some of these effects too. What we did find was that youth with anxiety or with generalized anxiety reported greater symptoms across all the different measures, which was not surprising. We had expected to find that. But we did find that those symptoms seemed to be conditional based on their sleep architecture profiles. So we found that relationship between slow wave sleep and negative affect throughout the day. So greater slow wave sleep seemed to be protective for negative affect. And this is in line with research in adults that suggests that slow wave sleep might help reduce some of the emotional symptoms we experience after negative emotional events throughout the day. It helps sort of dissipate those negative feelings. We also found the associations between REM sleep and depressive symptoms as well. And so again, as I mentioned before, these children didn't have any mood disorders, which makes them somewhat unique. But what this might indicate is that some of these children who have anxiety, who are also experiencing these alterations in sleep architecture, might be the kids who are most at risk to go on to develop depression later on in life. And this might also have something to do with the role that we see in terms of REM sleep in particular in learning and memory. So in particular, REM sleep tends to impact emotional learning and memory and helps us process emotional events. And so this might be something that that's contributing to that as well. And so we found these effects for our anxious sample, but not for our control participants. And so this is in line with research in adults that does find differential effects for adults with a diagnosis, in particular a depression diagnosis, versus healthy participants. And so research in adults shows that people with depression, if you actually deprive them of REM sleep, so don't let them have REM sleep, they actually seem to get better. It tends to be very short-lived, but it actually tends to help. Whereas for healthy participants, if you deprive them of sleep, they tend to get worse. And so these findings suggest that we might be onto something similar in these younger samples as well. Of course, the study had a few limitations. One is that we just looked at self-reported emotional experiences and psychiatric symptoms. And we only focused on negative emotional processes. But given that we found some effects with depression, which also tends to be associated with less positive affect, there might be something there as well. And then this was also correlational too. So we didn't manipulate sleep, we just looked at how it naturally occurs. And so as a result, we can't necessarily determine if sleep is causing these emotional problems or if the reverse is happening. So thinking about these limitations, that brings me to my next study. And so my next study actually manipulated sleep to look at the impact on both positive and negative emotions in children. And so what I was mainly interested in looking at was, like I mentioned, both positive and negative emotions, to look at both self-reported affect and then also subjective reports and behavior in response to different emotional stimuli. So participants for this study were 55 children. Again, they were between the ages of 7 and 11, and they were all also prepubertal as well. One thing that's different from this sample, from the other sample, is that they had a range of emotional symptoms, but none of them met criteria for any psychiatric disorders. So we looked for kids who were at risk, but were not necessarily at the threshold that they would meet criteria for a disorder. And then all of these children were also healthy sleepers. Oops. There we go. All of these children were also healthy sleepers, so they all slept between 8 to 10 hours a night, which is about the recommended amount for a kid of that age. It didn't have any sleep disorders. They also didn't have any medical disorders that would impact sleep as well. So the structure of the assessments that these children completed, they first came in for a screening assessment where we conducted psychiatric interviews with them. And they also completed a range of different self-report questionnaires. And then we had them complete one night of baseline sleep where they wore an actigraph watch, and then we also conducted polysomnography with them again. And then we had them complete an emotional assessment after this night. So the idea behind this was that this was a night of healthy sleep. We would look at their typical emotional reactions the next day. And then after that, they completed a week of normal sleep, so between 8 to 10 hours. And then following that, we had them complete 2 nights of sleep restriction. So the first night they slept for 7 hours, and then the second night they slept for just 6 hours. And then following those 2 nights of sleep restriction, they completed another similar emotional assessment to the first time. And so the results I'll be talking about today compare the emotional assessment after a healthy night of sleep and then after 2 nights of sleep restriction. So during the emotional assessments, we had them conduct just the baseline physiological recording. Then we had them report on their affect and anxiety. So they reported on their positive affect at the moment, their negative affect at the moment, and their anxiety symptoms at the moment. And then we had them view a series of different emotional images. So we had both positive and negative emotional images, and we had them report on how they felt when they viewed those images. And then we had them watch a series of different movie clips. So again, we had both positive and negative movie clips. And again, we had them report on their reactivity during those movie clips. And then we also recorded their facial expressions as well during those clips. And to assess their reactivity, we assessed both their valence and their arousal. So the top line of images was to assess their valence. So they would indicate on this line how positive or negative that they felt. And the bottom line indicates their arousal. So they indicated how excited or jittery or how calm or bored they felt, essentially. And then to assess facial expressions, we used a software called face reader software. And I have an example of that here. And so I'll go ahead and play this so you guys can watch how the software operates. And what you'll see is that there's a lot of different things going on. The software gives you a lot of output. So you'll be able to see the girl change her facial expression, and you'll see changes in the different output that you see. So as you can see, as she smiles, you see changes in the output on the bottom where it indicates that she feels happy. And essentially the way the software works is it highlights different muscles on the face, and based on the different combinations that are moving, it determines what facial expression is being displayed. Most of the time people code this by hand, and it takes a lot of time, so it's really nice to have the software that does it for us. Okay, so first just looking at self-reported emotion. What we found was that after sleep restriction compared to the healthy night of sleep, we found that there was less positive affect. However, we didn't find any effects for either negative affect or negative emotion or anxiety symptoms. And then looking at results for the images, so viewing the positive and negative images, we didn't find any changes in those valence ratings, so how good or bad they felt when viewing the images, and that was for both positive and negative. However, reported arousal was different for positive images, but not negative images. So when viewing positive images, kids were reporting that they were experiencing less arousal after sleep restriction compared to their healthy night of sleep. And so just to give you an idea of what this actually looked like in the lab, so this is the same girl that you saw before. So this video I'll show is her after a healthy night of sleep, reacting to both a positive and a negative image. Okay, so that's what we would consider a pretty normal reaction, so it's very clear what she's feeling in the moment. So this next video is going to be after her 2 nights of sleep restriction, viewing very similar positive and negative images. So as you can see, very little reaction whatsoever. So So in terms of the movies where we actually analyze these facial expressions, you can see these results as well. So what we found was very similar to the images where when they were viewing different movie clips, there were no changes in their reports of valence, so how good or bad they felt, for both positive or negative movies. However, for their reported arousal, we did see differences, again, just for the positive movies, but not for the negative movies. So again, similar to the images, we saw that there was blunted or less arousal when watching the positive movies after sleep restriction compared to a night of healthy sleep. When we looked at their actual facial expressions using the face reader software, what we did was we extracted 2 different outcomes from the face reader software. So again, their valence and arousal to match their self-reports. And what we found was that there were no differences in their valence and their facial expressions for both positive or negative movies. However, we did find differences in terms of their arousal of their expressions. So again, this was only for positive movies and not negative movies, where there was less arousal in response to the positive movies. So just to summarize, what this study shows is that a loss of sleep in children, and one thing that's important to note is that this was really just a mild loss of sleep, so 7 hours and then 6 hours, which, if a child is up late one night because there's a family party or a sleepover, this is something that can just sort of naturally occur. We found these effects still regardless. So you can think about what might happen if the sleep loss is occurring nearly every night over the course of years, over the course of development. These effects might be more profound, especially as kids are learning about how to control their emotions and how they should be responding in different emotional situations. And the effects that we found tended to be particular to arousal in particular, so their arousal reactions. And this seemed to be specific for positive experiences and not necessarily for negative experiences. And so the study did have some limitations, of course. One was just the validity of it because these assessments occurred in the lab. It doesn't really give us a lot of information about what might be happening in the real world when they're experiencing emotions, for instance, with their friends or at school or in other contexts such as that. We also might have experienced some habituation effects. So since kids had already been in the lab once and they had already viewed similar stimuli, they might have just naturally experienced some reduced arousal. And then one thing that I hadn't mentioned before is that when we restricted their sleep, we had them stay up late and wake up early. And one reason why this is important is that we can't necessarily tell what type of sleep we're losing when we do that. As I mentioned before, slow wave sleep tends to occur more so in the beginning of the night, and rapid eye movement sleep tends to occur later in the night. So if we would have restricted the last few hours of sleep, we would be able to say that this might be due to less rapid eye movement sleep, but we don't necessarily know that. So just an overall summary of the effects that I've talked about today. One thing that I hope you guys take home is that across many nations across the world, people are not getting enough sleep. And this seems to be getting worse as well, especially for children and adolescents. And one reason why this is important is that sleep patterns are important for emotional functioning in childhood, which might have implications for their mental health. And so the studies that I talked about reviewed both kids who are at risk for emotional problems, so children with anxiety disorders, and also healthy children as well. And the different types of sleep patterns I looked at were slow wave sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, and then also sleep duration as well with that sleep restriction study. And one thing that is something that deserves some further consideration is that these effects seem to be strongest for these positive emotional processes. And so thinking about what that means in our day-to-day life might be important. And I think the biggest point of this is that sleep is very modifiable. So sleep problems tend to be fairly easily treated depending on the sleep problem. And so as a result, this might be an easy factor to target when people are dealing with emotional difficulties. However, we really need more developmental research on this to better understand when is the best time to intervene and how we can best intervene. And so that brings me to some future directions, some areas that have really not been explored in the sleep and emotion research area. And a big one is thinking about emotion generation versus emotion regulation. And so a lot of the findings I talked about today have to do with emotional responses and emotional experiences that we have. However, there's a lot of different things that might occur leading up to an emotional response. So to experience an emotional response, you first have to be in some type of emotional situation. You need to attend to whatever it is in your environment that might be positive or negative. And you need to appraise or think about that thing in a way that is either positive or negative. And there's a lot of things we can do that influence this process. So there's ways that we can change what situation we put ourselves in, we can change what we pay attention to, we can change how we think about certain events, and we can actually change our reaction or our response after it occurs. However, there's really been very few studies that have looked at these different things we can do to change these emotional experiences and how sleep might impact those different types of emotion regulation strategies. And so I've touched on this a little bit with some of my own research, and so one study that I conducted looked at how sleep problems might relate to different types of emotion regulation strategies. And while we found that a lot of emotion regulation strategies are impacted, so greater sleep problems was related to less ideal emotion regulation, it didn't impact all strategies. So greater sleep problems were associated with more suppression, more rumination, less problem solving, and greater avoidance. However, it was not associated with cognitive reappraisal, which is essentially changing the way you think about a situation to make it more positive or better. A study that looked at this using a more rigorous design also found similar effects for cognitive reappraisal. So the study took 42 teenagers and had them sleep 1 week of healthy sleep for 1 week, and then randomly assigned them to either be sleep restricted, so to sleep for 4 hours, or to sleep for 9.5 hours, so sort of like a night of ideal sleep. And then had them conduct a reactivity or a reappraisal task. So they were asked to view a series of negative images and either just view those images and then report on how they felt, or they were asked to cognitively reappraise those images. And what we found was that children who were sleep restricted reacted more strongly to those negative images compared to the kids who had the night of healthy sleep, which you would expect. But both groups were able to cognitively reappraise, which suggests that that ability seems to be maintained even when you've lost some sleep. So I think what these two studies together suggest is that while emotion regulation is impacted, it's not that everything is impacted and everything is worse. And so we need to really investigate the specific strategies that might be most at risk. And then thinking about this in terms of development, what this means across development, there's been very, very few developmental studies that have looked at sleep and emotion. So we really need to understand how this might impact children as they're going through major life transitions. So as they're going through puberty, as they're starting secondary school, or starting any new transition like starting work, and how this might impact them during that time. And then also bidirectional influences as well. So I talked about how sleep might impact our emotional experiences, but there's some research that suggests that our emotional experiences also impact our sleep. So if you're experiencing more dysregulated emotion, it is more difficult to sleep at night. And so looking at that and how that plays out over time will be important. And then finally thinking about this in terms of different developmental contexts. So how sleep and emotion might both be impacted by different environmental factors. So things like culture, exposure to media, exposure to the blue light, and then also family influences as well. And so just a thank you to everyone who participated in the research, and then also everybody on my research team, and then all of my funding sources as well. And thank you guys for listening to me and listening to my research. I really appreciate that. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to open it up.
You know, when you hooked up the kids, you know, the first night with those EEG, the slimography machine, can they sleep?
That's a really good question. So the question is, when children are doing polysomnography and they're hooked up to all the equipment, if they can sleep. The short answer is not no. So there's something that's been established in the literature called like a first night effect. So when children are in the lab, it's a new environment, it's a scary environment, they're wearing all of the stuff they don't usually wear, and it impacts their sleep for sure. And that's unfortunately one thing in this study that we weren't able to control just because of resources. What we would want to do is have them come in for a night, do like a fake night essentially, and then do a real night after that. And what we found in our research is that our anxious kids have the most trouble, especially if you bring them into a hospital and they're sleeping in a hospital. It's very scary, and so they tend to be the most impacted. So in the last study I talked about, we tried to counteract that by having them wear all the equipment at home, so it was a familiar environment. I hope it helped. I don't know if it did, but yeah, it's definitely a limitation in the area that makes it really difficult to really capture what natural sleep looks like. And that's where the watches, the actigraph watches help, because you can have people at home wearing it. It's not very invasive, and so you tend to get more naturalistic patterns. Yeah, that's a good question.
How long did you collect all of these?
How long? A very long time. So I guess that's another challenge with this area is that it typically involves a lot of effort from families. So I didn't collect the data for the first study I had talked about, but the second study with the sleep restriction took about 2.5 years. It took a long time, yeah.
Or only 55 kids?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Which is why it's only 55 kids. I wish we would have had more, but
That's so much.
yeah.
Seems like sleeping deprivation doesn't affect much for the cognitive, but more for emotion, especially how they react or respond to positive emotion. Is that right?
That's a good question. So in terms of how it impacts mood compared to other areas like cognitive functioning, what the research generally shows is that sleep seems to impact everything. So there was one study who had compared the effects of sleep and how it impacts mood and cognitive functioning, and then it was like physical performance, and they found effects for all of them. Mood tended to be the most profound, so those effects tended to be strongest. The downside of that study was that it was conducted in 1996, and there's been a lot that's been done since then. And as far as I know, nobody's compared since then to see what tends to have the strongest effects. So it does impact all of those things, but mood does seem to be what's most profoundly impacted.
Why do you think it's impact only the positive events but not the negative ones for the children?
Yeah, so that's very, very something I've thought a lot about. The short answer is I don't know. So I guess my first thought is that I don't think it's not impacting negative. I think one downside is that our sample was very small. I think if we had a larger sample, we might pick up on some of those effects. And some of our negative findings were trending, so they were close to being significant but not. And so it could just be that the effects are not as strong and negative. The other thing I've thought about, and others have talked about this as well, who have found similar findings in adults, is that if you think about emotions and how it might be necessary for our survival, if you think about experiencing a negative emotion and how that might help you in terms of like evolutionary psychology, if there's a scary snake, you're afraid and you jump and you get away, and that saves your life. And positive emotions are beneficial for our survival, but the effects of that tend to be more long-lasting. So if you have more positive emotions, you develop better social relationships. You're more likely to engage with your environment, which is helpful, but those effects tend to be more long-term. And so if you're sleep deprived and your resources are not as great, you might retain those responses that you need if you are faced with a life or death situation, like a scary snake. Whereas those positive emotions might be the first thing to go because they might not be as necessary in the moment. That's my best guess. We really just need more research to understand why, but yeah.
I agree with that. Yeah, that's how I think about positive and negative.
Yeah.
Negative help you survive.
Right.
Positive help you being happy and
Right.
related. So if anything gonna be affected first, it's gonna be something that's not so important for life.
Right.
So the negative ones contact, but the positive one cannot reduce.
Right, and it's really interesting actually because in some of the adult research they actually find a greater reactivity to negative situations. which kind of makes sense when you're sleep deprived, you have slower reaction times and a lot of things are affected, like just generally you're slower. And so if you are faced with a life or death situation, you need to react in a greater way to be able to respond in a way that will help you survive. So that kind of supports that as well.
Also, when you use that application to detect the facial muscles, maybe you detect the smiling kind of things with more kind of muscles movement.
Yeah.
You can see it reduced easier than for the negative one that's quite close to the neutral one.
Yeah, they might look very different. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, from neutral to negative, and from neutral to positive, there's a big change.
It's true, and the same is true for when people code facial expressions by hand, but same for the software, is it tends to be, it does the best job with positive because it's so easy to detect, right? If someone's smiling, they're happy, whereas it's not the same with negative. So I think that definitely could be playing a role there as well.
Well, you must thank the families a
Yes.
lot, because I know that for the parents, to allow their kids to participate in your sleeping lab, it's not easy for them.
It's a lot, yeah. We have a sleep lab at the University of Houston, and so for these studies, children and parents came in, and they both spent the night with us overnight in, I don't want to say uncomfortable, but not the most comfortable beds. I mean, it's still like a small room, and so very grateful for all that they've done for us to help us out with our research.
What a fantastic talk today. Thank you so much, Cara and Ben, for giving us your time today for this special talk. And tomorrow at actually 6 a.m. in the morning, they have to fly out from Bangkok back home. So this is very a great pleasure for us for you to give us this opportunity to meet you two, and I'm sure this sparked a lot of research motivation for you guys to think more about how you can run series of research that keep asking and answering your interests in terms of finding what is going on in civic engagement and also in childhood and youth sleep and emotion. So this is such a wonderful time, and I hope that if you have any research question that in dealing with Southeast Asian or in particularly Thailand sample, it would be our great pleasure also as well to corroborate in the future. So at this moment, I would like to invite Dr. Pandrapi Sutiwan, the Dean of the Faculty of Psychology, to give a token of appreciation for both of you for your time and your wonderful talk today.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Have a nice trip home. Thank you very much.
One.
เดี๋ยวถ้าใครยังมีอะไรที่อยากจะคุยที่ดังเดิม
มีค่ะเดี๋ยวหลังจากนี้จะพา I will take them a tour around July, so if any student would like to be the ambassador with me, please show up to me, and I would be nice to have you guys showing them around as well.
And if you have any question, we may have about 5 minutes after this, for a break. And please feel free to talk to both of them, about his marvelous research. That's very, very interesting for me. And okay, so thank you very much for coming, and please have a nice trip home.
Thank you. Yes, thank you all for
And
your
hope you
time.
come back again.
Yes.